as some of you probably gather, and Hildebrand himself notes this at the beginning of chapter 12, the relation of being and value is exceedingly complex. The first course I took on this was with Professor Crosby. It was a whole course. I've only got an hour or less. So I cannot go into it all. And I want to leave plenty of time for discussion so that points that I mentioned that you're interested in, you can then bring up. So what I want to do is I'm going to explain my understanding of Thomas's position on being and value. And then I'm going to actually speak a little bit less about Hildebrand and compare him to Thomas. In that context, I'm going to raise my concerns with Thomas's position, which I believe Hildebrand would agree with. If Hildebrand wouldn't agree with me, Professor Crosby will correct me. And then I'm going to sort of hit you with a bunch of bullets, 7 or 8 bullets, which would take hours to explain each, but which we can talk about in the discussion, okay? So I want to talk first about some things in question 21, Article 1, which Chase told me he had given you the readings. And the parts that I want to first mention is the first difficulty. So he asks, does good add anything to being? And he says, everything is being essentially, but a creature is good not essentially, but by participation. Good, therefore, really adds something to being. So there is his position that if a being is not good essentially, then to say that it's good must add something to it, even if it's by participation, so something must really be added. Then I want to go to the contrary, which would be page 4, in which he quotes Augustine first, saying, inasmuch as God is good, we are, but inasmuch as we are good. It therefore seems that good does not add anything to being, in which now he's identifying being and good, and therefore concluding nothing's added. Then he has a much longer point in number 2, whenever things are so related that one adds something to the other, either really or conceptually, one can be understood without the other, but being cannot be understood without good. Hence, good does not add anything to being either really or conceptually. And then he gives a proof of the minor. God can make more than man can understand, but God cannot make a being that is not good, because by the very fact of its being from good, it is good, as Boethius makes clear. Okay? Now, the key to understanding this whole article is to understand what a conceptual relation is, because he's going to argue that nothing really can be added to being. What's added is something only in concept. Okay? And the best explanation, in my view, in Aquinas for this is on page 6, in which he explains what he means when he says a relation is conceptual. And so he says a relation is merely conceptual according to the philosopher, when by it something is said to be related which is not dependent upon that to which it is referred, but vice versa, for a relation is a sort of dependence. An example is had in intellectual knowledge and its object, as also in sense and sensible object. Knowledge depends upon its object, but not the other way about. The relation by which knowledge is referred to its object is accordingly real, but the relation by which the object is referred to the knowledge is only conceptual. According to the philosopher, the object of knowledge is said to be related, not because it is itself referred, but because something else is referred to it. The same thing holds true of all things which stand to one another as measured, and things measured, or as perfective and perfectible. Now, the way that I explain this in class, which some of you might be edified with, is I ask the students whether God can change. And of course, we have a good group of traditional students here, so without exception, they say no. Then I say to them, well, I can prove God can change. Here's the proof. If I pray to God, does God have the predicate of being prayed to? And of course they fall into the trap because they say yes. And I say, but if I stop praying to God, then he doesn't have the predicate of being prayed to. So he's lost the predicate he once had. Therefore he changed. But the point is, he didn't have a real predicate of being prayed to. See? He didn't have that. And so if I look at Mary, the relation of me looking at Mary is real. But the relation of Mary being looked at by me is not. It's merely conceptual. Or an example that a lot of Thomists like to refer to is, I think, in the work on De Potentia, in which he speaks about an animal in relation to a column. And so if an animal is in one position with respect to the column, we can say the animal is to the left of the column. While if the animal moves, then the animal would be to the right of the column. But in a similar way, nothing in the column changed. So that the column is to the left or the column to the right is not a real predicate of the column. See? You must understand the conceptual relation to understand his position here. Now we go to page 5. Does good add anything real to being? I'm going to skip the second sense in which it can be added for purposes of time, and it's not really essential or completely relevant to the issue. He says something can be added to something else in 3 ways. It adds some reality which is outside the essence of a thing to which it is said to be added. For instance, white adds something to body, since the essence of whiteness is something beyond that of body. So there would be a real addition. Roberts is old. See? Then thirdly, something is said to add to something else in concept only. This occurs when something which is nothing in reality, but only in thought, belongs to the notion of one thing and not to the notion of the other, whether that to which it is said to be added is limited by it or not. Thus, blind adds something to man, that is blindness, which is not a being in nature. Why? Why isn't evil blindness a being in nature? It's a privation, but merely a being in the thought of one who knows privations. By it, man is limited, for not every man is blind. But when we say a blind mole, no limitation is placed by what is added. Okay? Now we get to what I think is crucial here, and on which I'm going to make some comments about Thomas and also some comments about Hildebrand. He says, it is not possible, however, for something to add anything to being in general in the first way, though in that way there can be an addition to some particular sort of being. For there is no real being which is outside the essence of being in general, though some reality may be outside the essence of this being. And this is what's crucial. That is, nothing real could be added to being because being is taken to be encompassed by the 10 categories. But good is something that can be said of more than one of the categories. Therefore, it can't be a quality within one of the categories. So since good is applicable to the categories, by the very way the categories are understood, it can't itself be in one of the categories. But if it's not in itself in one of the categories, it's not real. Well, that doesn't sound very good, to say good is not real, unless it's convertible with being. It is the being, and the being is real. See? This is crucial, because I'm going to make a comment about this with respect to Hildebrand. Being a good cannot add something real to being, because good is applicable to more than one of the categories, and the categories are taken to encompass all being. But are we to conclude it adds nothing? No. Good must accordingly either add nothing to being or add something merely in concept. For if it added something real, being would have to be narrowed down by the character of good to a special genus, which is similar to the point that I was making. Now, he makes an interesting comment, and though some of you may know I'm not a Thomist, I do compliment Thomas when I think Thomas really deserves it. And in this instance, I think it's a very great compliment. Because he says, further, but since being is what is first conceived by the intellect, as Avicenna says, every other noun must either be a synonym of being or add something at least conceptually. The former cannot be said of good, since it is not nonsense to call a being good. That is, because this is a crucial point. Since being's what's first conceived, every noun must either be a synonym or add something at least conceptually. But being and good are not synonyms, because if they were synonyms, it would be nonsense to call a being good. Now, nonsense may not be the best term, and I never looked up the Latin. Who can tell me what Thomas is getting at here, except my past students? You see, if being and good were synonymous, to say a being is good would be an analytic proposition. It would be like saying, all apples are apples. So he really had the notion of the analytic proposition here. And by saying it's nonsense, I'm going to take that to mean he had in mind what Kant meant when Kant said the analytic proposition's not informative. As if I were to say, now I'm going to give you a necessary truth, because you all want necessary truths. Now here's a very important necessary truth. All apples are apples. Now you might say, that's ridiculous. That doesn't tell us anything. It's still necessarily true. That's what he has in mind. It's not nonsense to call a being good. Therefore, being and good must not be synonymous. But, as you know, he's going to say being and good are the same. So he has what distinction? Which another philosopher is credited with, not Kant. Anybody know? Frege. He has Frege's distinction of the difference between sense and reference. Morning star and evening star. Anybody remember that? Because he's saying, well, being and good are going to be interchangeable. They're going to be the same thing. But the words don't have the same meaning. Why? They're not synonymous. So their sense is different. Now, of course, he's not using the terminology Frege uses. But he has that distinction in mind, that two different words can have different meanings, but the referent is the same. That's why to call a being good is not nonsense, because their meanings are different, though the referent is the same. Okay? Just like if we say the only philosophy professor at Franciscan from Rhode Island and the only graduate student ever at the University of Dallas from Rhode Island. Well, those phrases have different meanings, though in each instance they refer to me. See? Is everybody all right with that? Now it gets interesting, because if the words are not synonymous, what then is Thomas required to do? Which he does.
Explain what being what good is.
Yeah, to explain what the meaning of the word good is. Because he says the being and good are not synonymous. I say, okay, I'll go along with that for now. What does good mean then? I make a parenthetical note. Did you notice that Thomas feels the requirement, which he's going to fulfill, of defining what he means by good? And Hildebrand in chapter 12 starts by agreeing completely with Thomas. He says in chapter 12, first we have to agree that the words being and good are different, have different notions, that these are different notions. To say that something is a being is not yet to have the notion of good. But did Hildebrand go on to define what he meant by good? or value? No. All right, we put that on the shelf for the time being. Now, how does he define the good? He defines it, of course, if we get to page 7, as a being is perfective. So this is the top of page 7. A being is perfective of another, not only according to its specific character, but also according to the existence which it has in reality. In this fashion, the good is perfective. Okay? I will tell the undergraduate students sometimes this, and everybody's looking at me like I'm speaking Greek, but I will talk about the ivs, the abuls, and the fulls. See? It's perfective, or it's despicable, that is capable of engendering, despising or contempt. It's contemptible, capable of engendering. So it's perfective. For the good is in things, as the philosopher says, inasmuch as one being, by reason of its active existence, is such as to perfect and complete another, it stands to that other as an end. And hence it is that all who rightly define good put in its notion something about its status as an end. The philosopher accordingly says that they excellently define good, who said that it is that which all things desire. First of all, and principally, therefore, a being capable of perfecting another after the manner of an end is called good. But secondarily, something is called good which leads to an end, as the useful is said to be good, or which naturally follows upon an end, as not only that which has health is also healthy, but anything which causes, preserves, or signifies health. And of course, the important definition here is the being capable of perfecting another after the manner of an end is called good. Okay? Now I'm going to make this point, that if before he said being and good are not synonymous, and therefore he had to give a definition of good, when he gives that definition of good, whatever the definition is that he would give, if he says approved by the king, commanded by God, liked by Roberts, whatever he would say, that definition that he gives now becomes synonymous with the word good. So that when I say being is good, if as a logical point I then define good as liked by Roberts, to say being is good is synonymous with saying being is liked by Roberts. He can't on the one hand say he's given the definition of good after claiming the two words are not synonymous, but then say he doesn't have synonymity between the word good and the definition that he gives. See? Look at the smirk on Angel's face, because he knows where we're going with this, right? It's fun, isn't it? I want to go to the bottom of page 7 to make a side remark, but since it concerns an issue that I've worked on a lot, I can't resist the opportunity to make this point. Because when he answers the difficulties, so maybe, remember the first difficulty was everything is a being essentially, but a creature is good not essentially, but by participation. Good, therefore, really adds something to being. If you look at the reply, the second paragraph, he says, and so it is that the essence of God, who is the last end of creatures, suffices for God to be called good by reason of it. But when the essence of a creature is given, the thing is not yet called good, except from the relation to God by reason of which it has the character of a final cause. In this sense, it is said that a creature is not good essentially, but by participation. Now, what's the point I want to make here? And that is, what will happen is, especially if you get, I think, to question 23, but in other of the writings of Aquinas, there are two ways to understand a Platonic position here. One would be the Platonic position which would deny something inherent to a being and claim that what was predicated was ideal. So that if we say Roberts and Crosby are human, human refers to something that is the ideal form outside of Roberts and Crosby. That position is clearly unacceptable. Human must refer to a principle of my being and a principle of his being. And the same thing with good. If we say Roberts is good and Crosby is good, Thomas will insist that good refers to something in us, not a participation in a good denying an inherent predicate. Now, I'll take one little swipe at some Thomists. They take the first interpretation of Platonism, which would deny something inherent and claim it was only by participation, rightly rip that to shreds and then say, see, we must insist that there's an inherent predicate or an inherent form. See, Plato was wrong. But if you read Thomas a little bit further, he will say, but you cannot have those inherent predicates or those inherent forms without a participation in the divine being. So though I'm not good essentially, because if I were good essentially, I would be God, I have the predicate of good, but since I don't have it of my nature, I must have it by participation in goodness itself. And in that respect, a second interpretation of Plato is possible, namely that though there are inherent forms, there's still a participation in the divine form. And Aquinas will insist on this in the case of all the good things: love, charity, being, goodness, wisdom. That I have it, I don't have it essentially, but since I don't have it essentially and have it, what explains why I have it? Well, only by participation. Maybe I'll perk your interest. I had started to write this article about 12 years ago, Aquinas' critique of Spinoza, which of course doesn't work because of the dates and so on. But you see, this is what Spinoza couldn't understand. One of the things I think he couldn't understand. How can I have my own act of existence if it's not of my essence to exist? How can I have my own act of existence if it's not my essence to exist? Well, only by participation. Well, if it's not of my essence to be good, how can I have good? By participation. That's why already back in 1989, when I wrote a paper on Aquinas and Hildebrand on this, I insisted that not only was Aquinas on these and several other points a Platonist, but he was more of a Platonist than Hildebrand was. But that's a side note. You see if you want to talk about that later. All right, I want to make sure I'm going to skip a couple of things. On page 11, he asserts in the second article at the end that being and good are interchangeable. Okay? That's sort of all I'm going to say about interpreting Thomas's position, unless someone wants to bring something up. Okay? I'm going to take it that none of you would wrongly attribute to Aquinas a relativism simply because he introduces in the definition of good the relational element of standing as perfective, because he only means it's capable of being perfective, not that it's good only when it is perfecting. So God would be good whether there's creation or not, because we're simply talking about its capacity to stand as an end, not that it does stand at an end. If it had to stand as an end to be good, then there would be a relativism. He would be good only if there were beings who were perfected by him. But that, of course, wouldn't at all work. Okay? One thing that makes the comparison to Hildebrand difficult is that Thomas is speaking of the good, and Aquinas and Hildebrand is speaking of value. And you should know by now that von Hildebrand would in no way identify the two. He, in fact, would identify good at best with his notion of importance, while value would only be one kind of importance. So a lot of what I'm going to say would have to be mitigated and modified or qualified by introducing that distinction, but if I do that, we're really going to get bogged down. So I'm going to sort of treat it as almost as if they were the same, only for the purposes of these initial comments, okay? Now, Aquinas certainly, as I mentioned before, agrees with Thomas that being and value are different notions. He spends 2 pages talking about that, sort of beating it into the ground, that there's no question that we have one thing in mind by the word being and another thing in mind by the word good. But does he think they're interchangeable? And in 12, he doesn't say. I'm actually going to point out that on the 4th point, one might interpret it really as Thomas's point, though those of us who know Hildebrand know he would not hold that they were interchangeable, but that would require other readings. But on the question of whether the notions are different, there's no question that they're different. Now, someone arguing in defense of von Hildebrand being more compatible with Thomas on this point might bring up this value that he mentions in chapter 12 about the value of being as such, which he says is not the ontological value, nor is it qualitative, and is also not the good or value which something has in virtue of existing. He agrees that there's a value that something has in virtue of existing, which Aquinas got from Boethius. At least Aquinas mentions Boethius, and that is grounded in the fact that if a perfectly good being, such as God, creates, everything he creates must be good, and therefore it must be good that it exists. So Hildebrand introduces this notion of value to being as such that's neither ontological nor qualitative, nor the good that something is that exists in virtue of being made by God. Now, John Henry isn't here. No. You can tell him I said this. I would disappoint John Henry if I didn't make at least one critical comment about von Hildebrand. And what I want to say is this. It's not clear to me that there is this value of being that Hildebrand talks about. Now, I'm a firm believer in values. I don't think they're interchangeable. I don't think it's captured by the notion of good as perfective. I don't think it's definable. So I'm in a completely different universe than Aquinas on this. But look, only if being, what would account for the value of this, of being as such? It couldn't be the nature, because then it would be ontological. It certainly couldn't be qualitative, and it can't come from the fact that it's made by God, because he says it's not the good that something has in virtue of being made by God. So what explains it? What's the foundation of it? I'm sure Dr. Crosby will have something to say about that later. But I'm not saying there isn't such a thing. I'm just not convinced by reading it that it's so obvious, okay? So if we work with ontological and qualitative values, would Hildebrand say these are convertible with being? So I want to go to page 152. I did find my copy of the Ethics, which disturbed me because it's one that I had Hildebrand autograph for me, so I didn't want to lose it. And since it's a fairly short paragraph, in the light of what I've said, look at what Hildebrand says. 152. He says, our next and fourth statement pertinent to the relation of being and value refers to the fact that every value is itself objectively a being. Hence, the value of being as such, as well as the ontological value of a specific being, and the qualitative values which it embodies, are themselves beings. The idea of adding to being something which itself is not equally being is obviously nonsensical. That sounds a lot like Aquinas. On the one hand, we clearly see that the notion of value and the notion of being are not identical, that the ontological values and above all the qualitative values cannot be reduced to anything else nor deduced from the notion of being. On the other hand, they are themselves being. Here we touch a typical mystery which we can only state without being able to penetrate it fully with our reason. And then he goes on to the fifth point. So it doesn't really tell us very much. You couldn't from that discern whether he thought they were interchangeable or not. Well, let's look at the options. Suppose they're interchangeable. Then he has fundamentally Thomas's position. But if they're not interchangeable, and he asserts that they must be being, they must be real, that only something real can be added to being, then he would encounter the difficulty which I started the lecture with, namely that if the categories are what encompass real being, Hildebrand would have to say there's real being outside of the categories. But what could that be? And he doesn't tell us. See the difficulty. I'm going to reiterate it because I think it's important. He either by that paragraph means they're interchangeable or he doesn't. We know from other writings and so on that he thought they were not interchangeable because he says good is indefinable. But on the other hand, he insists in that paragraph the values must be real. They must have being. But Thomas's reasoning was you've got to make them good and being convertible, because if you add anything real to being, you'd be limiting being. But being is all there is, as far as we know. So how could being be good or have value? Value refer to something real with being, but something real be added. Well, only if he were to develop a metaphysics in which there were being or reality outside of the categories. But he doesn't do that. I don't know where you want to go with that. What I propose to do is simply to list 8 bullets here. And I'll give some hint as to how I would develop these or what the issue is. I think some of them are clearly ones Hildebrand would agree with. They're points in which, in fact, were part of his whole development of the value philosophy. I'm not sure some of the criticisms that I would make of Thomas or that I'm going to make are ones that he would agree with, but we'll see. First point, which is one I've made. Von Hildebrand and Thomas agree that what God makes must be good, and so everything is good in virtue of existing. Hildebrand would hold that just by being a Catholic. The good that it exists, in being made by God, is not ontological value. It's not an ontological value. Since an ontological value is based upon the nature of the being, which would account for there being a hierarchy. Now, I remember when I was first introduced to Hildebrand, and I'd read some Hildebrand, and then I'd run into Professor Vainish's office and check if I understood this correctly. But when I hit this point, I was just flabbergasted. I, in fact, hit it when I was reading Boethius on this point. And I said, the good that something exists, that's not the ontological value. He says, yeah, that's obvious. You didn't know that. I said, no, I didn't know that. Because the good that it exists applies just as much to me as it does to a tree. There's no hierarchy. To get a hierarchy in which I'm going to say I have a higher value than an ape, and an ape higher than a tree, and a tree higher than a rock, requires the essence, requires the quiddity. That's not present in the good that it exists. So the good that it exists is not the ontological value. Third point. One thing that I find interesting is that, I'm not saying there is no answer here. So sometimes I will give to graduate students, as these guys know, good dissertation topics. As far as I know, they laugh, but as far as I know, only one student ever did this, David Klassen, who was an early student here, and we were doing some stuff in Thomas, and I said, here's an area of Thomas not developed, which is, if being doesn't have an essence, from where do we derive the principles of being, like the law of non-contradiction? Because we couldn't have it as an insight into the essence of being. According to them, there is no essence of being. Otherwise, there'd be a genus. So, and he said, I saw him at a conference in Canada, he said he had asked me what I thought Thomas's position was. I don't remember that conversation. I said, I think in Thomas the position is that it's innate. And so I met him at this conference, and he was quite excited. He says, Catholic Hugh is going to publish my dissertation. I said, what's it on? He says, well, it's on the topic you recommended. I said, well, what is that? And he explained it. And I said, well, what did I say the solution is? He says that it's innate. And I says, well, you think I'm right? He says, yeah, I think you're right. So, okay. So from where do we get the concept of being? There's no form. I don't say there isn't an answer. You can explore it. The more interesting question is this, which is something that I worked on in a paper which I revised twice and which I'm probably going to revise a third time, and that is, well, if being and good are not synonymous, from where do we get the concept good? Which I would say is a problem that applies to transcendental properties in general, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. So if everything that has being has unity, but being and unity are not synonymous, where do I get the notion that everything that has being has unity? Where does this come from? I was doing it with respect to whether beauty is a transcendental property, which is, of course, a real hornet's nest. But you could think about that. Fourth point. They certainly would agree that whenever you do something morally good, it perfects your will or human nature. To deny that would be, of course, ridiculous. The universe would be a very ridiculous place if by doing good I became less perfected, and by doing evil I became more perfected. So they've got to agree whenever you do something good, your nature is perfected. Now, where there would be the disagreement is that while Thomas would define the good as something relational, Hildebrand would say value is not something relational. The objective good for the human person and the subjectively satisfying, which I'm going to take you to be acquainted with, those clearly are relational because they're connected with a being being satisfied or a being being benefited. Those are relational. But value is not relational. And so Hildebrand would deny that all value or good is to be understood relationally, and he would then take exception to Thomas's definition in claiming that Thomas had only at best hit upon some good, but not all good, because value is not relational. Okay? In this context, I throw out another point here. What you will find confused both among Thomists, some Thomists, and among people who do non-Thomistic ethics is a confusion about whether a good or value is objective and whether it's intrinsic. And this has been around a while because G.E. Moore already in the 19th century wrote an essay on the concept of intrinsic value, in which he tried to point out that the good guys keep arguing, but morality has got to be objective. But he says, or values have got to be objective. He says what they really mean is it's got to be intrinsic. Because if one means by objective only that the object has it, where did I get that point from? Professor Crosby's Being in Value course, which was 38 years ago. Because I was in college when I was 11 and he was 15 teaching those. He actually used the example, which I'm sure he forgot, of Greece being ancient. Remember that? Yeah. So something can have a property. Aristotle saw this because when he defines the law of non-contradiction, he says, and in the same respect. So if I say the moon is far and close, aha, there's your objection to the law of non-contradiction, the moon is far and close. You're all going to pipe up, yeah, but in different respects. But then Aristotle understood that the moon really has these. They're predicable of the moon. It's just not intrinsic to the moon. It's in virtue of a relation. So if you mean by objective the object has it, I can say the moon is objectively far and objectively close, meaning that they have it, right? But they don't have it intrinsically. That's a different point altogether. It would be my position, I think Hildebrand's also, but I don't know of any place he wrote this, that by Thomas having to give the definition of good, he opens himself up to the naturalistic fallacy. Now, the difficulty with that comment is, in my experience, people have understood the naturalistic fallacy in two ways. The more common way, in my experience, is to say one commits the naturalistic fallacy when one logically derives an ought from an is. Because if in the conclusion appears the word ought, but in the premises the word ought doesn't appear, then you've committed a naturalistic fallacy. I mean, basically it would simply be a logical fallacy. There'd be nothing ethical about it. Whenever I have something in the conclusion not in the premises, I've got a fallacy, right? So that wouldn't be a very big deal. In what I teach is that the naturalistic fallacy is rather that one makes as a principle of valuation something natural. In other words, when I say, here's what I'm going to do, I'm going to define the good as liked by Roberts. That's the naturalistic fallacy. And it becomes a naturalistic fallacy for the simple reason that what Roberts likes is itself something subject to an evaluation. See? You can make a little note. That's a problem with divine command ethics. I'm not going to go into it. So it's rather that if I take some natural predicate, some natural principle, and I make that the principle of evaluation, then I have the naturalistic fallacy. And I think it's very important because we need to have a sense of ideals. So when my kids wanted to see Harry Potter 15 years ago, and I left it up to my wife, there were three positions: yes, no, and we go with them. And I wasn't going with them. So she simply said no. But the response was, Professor Williams lets his kids go, and my response was naturalistic fallacy. Which of course they get completely disgusted with. And I said, well, why is he the standard? I have just as much right to be the standard as him, no? Then they realize, well, wait a minute, neither of you are the standard, which is the point, see? Because we're not basing our decision on something arbitrary. So if I take the definition of good, X perfects my nature. So then you're going to want to say, well, then how would you define it to avoid this? And then It can't be defined. That's what I would say. It can't be defined. And in a way, this applies particularly in Hildebrand, because when he gets to the notion of morality, he doesn't define it. He simply lists a number of essential predicates about it, because it would be my position. Anytime you define it, you introduce Moore's open question. That is, you take the definition, take what it is you're defining, and then pose a question in which you ask, is what's perfective of your nature good? But that should be nonsense. Because if what's perfective of your nature is the definition, then to ask whether it's good is only to ask whether what's good is good. But that seems to be a meaningful question to ask. Now, if the value isn't definable and avoids the naturalistic fallacy, that's how I can get an ought from an is. Because for me, it's perfectly reasonable to say, since X is good, X ought to be done. Why not? But if I define good in naturalistic terms, that would be the fallacy. Okay. All right. One thing, so I mentioned in my opening remarks that I almost gave up philosophy because there was simply some answers I wasn't getting. One thing that bothered me with the Thomistic definition, which I did write a paper on and gave at a conference, I forget where, but it was loaded with Thomists, how by that definition you could explain non-self-regarding motives. Because if what's good is what's perfective of my nature, then it seems if I'm motivated by the good, I'm motivated to do it to perfect my nature. But that seems to be self-regarding. See? Only one of the Thomists made a comment, a priest that I knew. He says, well, what about if it perfects another being's nature? Which I had not thought of, but it would seem to me, well, but then why would I take an interest in something perfecting another being's nature? Well, because I love them. But then why should I love them? Then it seemed to now be circular. Well, I love them because it perfects my nature, but that's what we're back to, see? So it's difficult to explain the non-self-regarding motivation. I have only 2 more points. How by Thomas's definition could you ground a categorical imperative? So some of the Thomists in Dallas would say X perfects your nature, and then I would say, but why should I perfect my nature? They say, well, if you want your nature perfected, then do this. But that's the hypothetical imperative, not the categorical. See? Their response was to say it's commanded by God. But then why ought I to obey God? So we must move the question one step back. And now what I think Hildebrand would very much agree with is that, this is my last point, that when he introduces the notion of good as standing as perfective of an end, he doesn't introduce anything that's moral. How is that the element of morality? See, now in class I'm honest with the students. I say, this deontological position where you deny the convertibility seems to be very weak. First I make all the criticisms, then you say, well, define the good or value, and I say I can't do it. But then I say this, I can make an experiential or phenomenological point, which of course also seems kind of weak. Remember I said, they both got to agree that whatever is morally good perfects your nature. You've got to grant that. But if that's how the good is defined, that would mean that when I'm presented with something of a very high moral, elevating nature, my experience of it can be no more than the respect in which it perfects that other being. The example I use in class is Colby, Monsignor Colby. Certainly what he did perfected his nature. No question about it. But if that's what moral goodness is, my experience of the moral goodness of that action could be no more than the respect in which it had perfected his nature. But then seems like weak position, because you say, yeah, I experienced something more, but what is it? I say, I can't define it. See, this doesn't seem to be very illuminating. But that's what the deontological position is. Okay, that was enough. Well, what I would be interested in is first whether you wanted to correct anything on what I had said about Hildebrand. Or whether you wanted to add something from a writing that would interest me.
Well, one thing that might be added is that I think on a Hildebrandian basis, there is some kind of definition of value. If by definition you mean pointing value out unambiguously, identifying it in distinction to everything else. In that respect, you could say the categories of importance, when he introduces the idea of the importance which is worthy of a right response.
Yeah.
You could say, all right, here you want to know what value is? I define it like this. It's that importance in a thing which merits or calls for a right response. So one of the notes of value could be invoked and yield a definition in the sense of pointing the phenomenon of value out, picking it out from everything not itself.
Yeah.
In that sense, or you could say value, in the spirit of Hildebrand, is that in virtue of which something not only is but ought to be. Various statements about value vis-a-vis the other categories of importance could be turned into a kind of definition.
Yeah.
Not in the sense that it would ever substitute for experiencing value through itself, but in the sense that you could discourse about it, point it out, and even point it out through some of its defining marks.
But he wouldn't take that to be synonymous with the term, would he?
With which, no, it wouldn't be, no, it would not be, it would be a definition in the sense of identifying it.
Right.
And pointing to it and nothing else.
Yeah.
So in that sense of definition, it's perhaps worthwhile acknowledging that von Hildebrand allows definition.
By a certain definition of definition.
Yes, by a certain definition.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to, convey the impression that discourse is just shut down with regard to value.
But you would agree with the Moore's open question issue that were one to define it in a certain way, the open question criticism would arise.
Naturalistic way.
Right.
Now this would be a definition that wouldn't be naturalistic.
Right.
If you just said that which is worthy of a right response.
Yeah.
That I don't think would be exposed to the so-called open question argument.